As a very young child in grade school, I joined the Cubs, the younger version of the Scouts. As a Cub Scout, we would often go camping or have sleepovers at public buildings. This particular time, we stayed at the old Amherstburg Asylum. At the time, we were told it was an old orphanage, which is true to an extent. The building has been many things over the years. It was properly known as the Fort Malden Lunatic Asylum. Anyway, we stayed there one night. We all slept on the floor of the main level. The building resembles a very large colonial house. It's a 2.5-story brick house with old wooden floors, many wooden windows, and a steep old grand staircase. The house is broken up into many rooms. As an old house, it seemed harmless. Besides that, there were 20 of us Cub Scouts and a few leaders staying the night. I was a pretty happy kid and didn't have many nightmares, but the night we stayed at the old asylum, I did. Well, once I fell asleep, it wasn't exactly easy to sleep there. The house is filled with all kinds of strange noises, like creaks and clunks. I guess this is typical of an old house, but the sound of running footsteps wasn't, and it bothered all of us, even the leaders. Several boys had trouble sleeping, and I remember a few of them saying that boys were out of bed running around. The leaders would do a head count with a flashlight, and all would be accounted for. I remember that it wasn't until really early in the morning that I actually fell asleep. Between the noises and the leaders getting up to check reports of kids out of bed, sleep finally came. And so did a disturbing nightmare. I dreamed that the house was full of kids that were wandering around confused, angry, and crying. They would walk around as if trapped and stop to look at us sleeping. Many of them had bleeding eyes, vicious bruises on the side of their heads, or black tongues. It was a really creepy dream. When I got home the next day, I slept all day. The visions of the kids in the asylum stayed with me for a few days, but I eventually forgot about it. Many years passed, and I was now in high school. It was then that I learned that the building was once an asylum. I wanted to check it out, but the building was closed to the public, only open to tours or special occasions. I didn't dwell on it since there were many other things to investigate in the area. More years passed, and eventually I got a job, a wife, and kids. 15 more years passed, and I found myself back in the Cub Scouts as a volunteer leader. My son was now a Cub, and like the good old days, we did a lot of sleepovers. I was really excited to hear that we were sleeping over at the fort. I thought that the kids would love sleeping in the army barracks, and the trip would be great. Little did I know, we were not sleeping in the army barracks. We were, of course, sleeping in the asylum. This was mildly disturbing, actually quite the mind grinder. Instantly, a warning flag popped up in the back of my head, but the years had placed a thick layer of cobwebs between my memories and my mind. I had forgotten the impact of the whole experience I'd had as a youth. The minute I walked into the building, though, it all came back to me. The place was set out of time, as if time had not passed at all. It was identical to what it was when I was a kid. Knowing more about the building this time, I was a bit freaked out by the still air and the feeling of a presence sensing that I had returned. Being an adult, I quickly swept away those thoughts and focused on the time at hand. So I had returned to the asylum. Now I was the leader, and we had 12 kids sleeping on the floor. Of course, the kids didn't sleep. They heard the noises and were scared. Someone must have let it slip that they were in an asylum. The running footsteps were back, and the other leaders started to comment on them. We did a head count, and all the kids were in their sleeping bags. Some of the kids said they saw other kids out of bed running around in the halls. So, as leaders, we took turns checking on the kids through the night. I have to admit, I was really unnerved when I found myself walking through the asylum halls and rooms at night with a little pocket flashlight. With every turn I took, I half believed I would see a horrified ghost child, but I didn't see anything. Thank God, because my wife would have left me if I returned home without the kid. I did manage to get enough courage to go upstairs and seek out the source of the footsteps. The second floor had several small rooms with the dim moonlight flooding into each of them, casting shadows across the floors. The rooms were mostly empty, but all had a few items in them, a single chair or table. They all had wooden floors and showed the markings where a table once was or the legs of a bed. The second floor was eerily still. Actually, that's when I noticed that the running footsteps had stopped. I had a very cold chill and the strong feeling that I was the focus of attention. So I backed out slowly and returned to the downstairs area. The other leaders asked me what I saw, and I told them the truth. I didn't see anything. Even then, none of them were willing to go upstairs on their turn to patrol the area. Needless to say, it was a long night. I did fall asleep early in the morning, and again, I had the nightmares of wandering kids with bleeding eyes and black tongues. When I awoke that morning, the daylight made the building feel peaceful. I quickly swept away the nightmare as a lingering fear from the nightmare I had when I was a kid. I actually felt silly about getting all worked up. The Cub Scouts were in rough shape from the sleepless night, and the kids were very groggy. Breakfast was being served outside on a picnic table. The conversation around the table was, of course, the creepy noises. I was barely paying attention to the kids' conversations when I heard one of the cubs complain about dreaming about kids with bleeding eyes. I think I nearly dropped the pancake I was flipping. More kids talked about having the same dream. Not all the kids, but 5 or 6, so about half the group. Even one of the leaders said that he had also dreamed about the zombie-like children. This set my freak level quite high. I was very glad once the day was over and the parents were picking up their kids. Of course, I was one of the last leaders to leave. On the way out, I stopped and had a brief conversation with who I assume was the groundskeeper. I actually didn't know who he was or why he was there. He just appeared and started talking to us about the asylum. He asked if I had stayed there overnight, and I said yes. He said I'd never sleep in there. Of course, I asked why, and he said, "Too many bad spirits. I hear them running around sometimes when I'm here late in the afternoon." So I asked him, "Do you believe it's haunted?" And he told me yes. The man was about 80 years old. He said his great-aunt was committed to this asylum as a child, and that's what brought his family to Amherstburg. He said that when she came out of that place, she was never the same. His father, the aunt's brother, said she looked like a zombie and often cried when she looked at the place. They'd only moved a few houses away, basically across the street. He also told me that this asylum was one of the first to use shock therapy and lobotomies in Canada. He said the doctor was a forerunner of science and would perfect his practice on new patients. The doctor had talked his grandparents into moving to Amherstburg to help their daughter with the promise of a cure through new science. The conversation continued as my Aunt's words deepened with every syllable. He said the whole asylum was shut down after only about 10 years of use. The town was so upset over the treatment of the troubled kids that they chased the doctor out of town. The asylum was converted into an orphanage and eventually surrendered to the town. Needless to say, the information from this nameless old man left me speechless and very troubled. A couple more years passed, and I had forgotten the disturbing memories of the asylum. It was movie night, and I was watching Sucker Punch. The scene where they punch a steel spike into the brain of people through their eye socket came up, and that's when I realized that that's what a lobotomy was. That's when it finally all came together for me. Okay, I'm slow. The kids with the bloody eyes were victims of a lobotomy. The bruises on the heads were the shock therapy. The black tongues, well, I still don't know. But it all became a lot more real to me once it added up. I decided to research the asylum a bit. It had operated in the mid-1800s for only a decade. There were about 240 patients at a time. The patients were used as a free labor force. They ranged in age from 13 to 55. They used hydrotherapy, which is cold and hot water submersions, shock therapy, lobotomies, and drug therapy to treat all kinds of mental illnesses. After all of my research, I'll have to say there's not much factual data out there. I was surprised to find the conditions they considered treatable mental illnesses, especially in women. Many women that were locked up as patients were people that were perfectly sane. Examples are women who had gotten pregnant before marriage or had overly active, irregular menstrual conditions. Also, women who are attracted to other women and people who had medical problems like fainting or seizures. Even talking disorders or twitches and tics. Many people who were imprisoned for debt crimes took insanity pleas so they could be treated and possibly released. Apparently, there's a list somewhere out there of all the inmates and whether or not they were released or deceased. There were very few who made the released list. I find this period of history the most disturbing. The instruments and infirmaries were very sanitary and wholesome on the outside, but the shady basements in reality were quite different in a horror film sort of way.